let's get started. What I'm basically going to do is go through the release notes, not everything, but as much as I can, because there's so much great stuff that happened in R37. But you can also go out to our portal under the What's New section and read the complete release note summary and the 3 highlights that we posted. So that's always available for you there. And I'm going to go through the release notes by user group and then hopefully try to demonstrate as much as I can after each section. And feel free to ask questions then also. So the first group is the API, REST API, Extensions API user group. We did a minor version update from 1.520 to 1.521, so we consider it minor, meaning that you don't technically have to swap out the client applications, Explorer, Admin 2, Architect, but obviously you're going to want to, because otherwise you won't get all the great client enhancements and bug fixes in the clients. Also, to obtain any new newly introduced item types, part types, attribute types, your API applications that you've developed in-house would need to be recompiled, and the REST API, if you're using it, would need to be upgraded to obtain them as well. And actually in R37, we are introducing one new attribute type. So if you're going to be using that attribute type, you have to recompile your API applications and upgrade the REST API. And just a note, your old clients like R36 you could use that to log into an R37 server, but not vice versa. You can't just upgrade your clients and log into your R36 installation. So the general rule of thumb is always update your server. It's the easiest thing to just swap out files. If you're going to have a version mismatch, if you have to do that, you should always make sure that the server is newer than the clients, as long as they're compatible. And of course, this is a breaking change then. If you want to use the new attribute types, the new attribute type that we're implementing here. We did a version update of our extension API, so all of your in-house developed extension views will need to be recompiled. So that's a breaking change. We did some enhancements to the extension API. There's now new methods to launch the standard Explorer dialogues for editing attribute values. We implemented a way to use the path language, the SystemWeaver path language, to create mapping item names. And there's now support for a custom attribute that's called a unique ID in the extension API. It's similar to identity attribute, and it's built on the use of 2 custom attributes, one that defines like a context and one that defines the ID. So those are all in the extension API now. Moving on to architects, lots of cool things happening. We have this new attribute type that I mentioned. It's called signature. It uses a data dimension single. It requires that you use a unique network ID, so your Windows network username and password. You can only use this attribute with items where the status is CS released. And the username and the display name that's saved at the time of signature is never affected by future changes. If you get married and change your last name or whatever, it stays as it was at the time of signing. And you can never remove this attribute from the item. I mean, it is CS released anyways, and a signed item can never be deleted from the database. And since you can't delete the item, and it has CS released, that item and any referenced items, including previous versions, can never be deleted. And you can also use this new signature attribute type with issues. And this is what it looks like. The user clicks on the editor buttons here, it gets a pop-up, they enter their username, network password, click sign, and they get this confirmation of signature. So that is available now. Yep. And this is what it looks like once it's been signed, just a collapsed editor there, or attribute. In our release notes, I like to bring up if we have any new extensions or breaking changes in existing extensions. So I just wanted to mention that we have 4 new extensions for AutoSAR. An exporter has some import, mostly the first one is an exporter, but instance deployment, interface deployment, and AutoSAR topology editor. So if you want to find out more about those, just email me at support@systemite.se, and I can put you in contact with someone that can provide more information, and we can make a delivery if you're interested. Clone item view, we now have support for inheritance for the optional ignore description element. So this means that you could clone a structure, but not the content, the descriptions. And previously you could do this, but you would have to, include an ignore description for each of the item types that are in the cloned structure that you wanted to ignore the description for. But now you have an option to include the SID of the parent item type, and it would ignore all the descriptions of the subtype. So it looks something like this. I just put an I there for item. And you would get a cloned structure with no content. So that might be an option that could be of interest. Coverage mapping item view, there's now support for single on the right side. So previously we only had support for list on the right, the secondary side, the right side. Now there's support for single as well. And how this works is that there's a new attribute called, I need to update this. It's not called distinct or unique to pairs. It's called distinct mapping per pair. And if you set that to true, it enforces a one-to-one relation, meaning that it will always create a new mapping item for the selected pairs. And then in order to do this, the part multiplicity in the meta model must be single for that part. And if you set it to false, it enforces replacement for the existing left mapping item. And the default is false. So you would just use it if you want to implement this new distinct mapping per pair. And it looks like that. Coverage matrix is one of our extension views. Right now it's part of the hazard identification extension, and we've made some improvements. One of them is a breaking change, and it is that we removed the not applicable mapping item, and we replaced it with an optional constraint items tag that you would use together with 2 new optional settings. One of them is not applicable, true or false, and quick add mapping, true or false. So not applicable is going to highlight the corresponding cell in the coverage in the view, gray, just grayed out. And quick add mapping allows for a single click mapping to be created. So this is how the new, if you're working with not applicable items, you have constraint items, and then you've got your 2 new attributes you can set on the mapping item. And we implemented support for multiple mapping items per configuration. So here's a config called 2, and it's got 2 mapping items in it. We implemented support for these additional attribute types: identity user, custom identity computed, and custom computed. Here's an example of how you would use coverage matrix parameter for the custom computed. And I brought this up with the extensions API we implemented so that you could use the path query language to set the mapping item name. And here's a generic example of that there. Yes. Oh yeah, and we updated the GUI somewhat. So at the bottom of the view is a faulty mappings pane, and that's now hidden if there's no faulty mappings. But you could always, pull it and open it up to see what's there, or you can hide it. So that's a breaking change. If you do use this extension view from us, that you'll need to go and rework your not applicable configuration part. Okay, we did I have to say we did a lot of optimization for performance in R37. I think in about 5 areas. One of them is grid. We implemented an option to optimize. So what this is an attribute on the top level grid called optimized, and it basically defines if each cell in text column and item attribute columns are going to be recalculated constantly or not, as you're working. So valid views are true or false. Basically, if you don't implement this, the default is false. It's going to work as before. True means that each value is only going to be calculated once. So when you're working in the grid, so this is going to be suitable if the grid is like for obtaining a snapshot and you're just going to export it to Excel. The optimization is with grid generation, grid scrolling, the Excel export. And if you're using it, you could always, refresh by hitting F5, during your viewing. And with false then is the behavior from before. Each value is going to be recalculated when you're working and editing in the grid. So this is suitable if you always want the values to be updated. But of course, then your grid generation and export is going to include the time that it takes to obtain all the relevant, up-to-date values from the database. Because they're doing calculations. So we're seeing extreme improvement when you have the grid optimized. So we recommend architects to really go through and review your grids. And if there's any that are really slow, or that people are just loading it to export to Excel, go ahead and put this new optimized equals true in there, and it'll go much faster. I'm going to show this. I think I have an example to show as well on that in a moment. Okay. Item ribbon configuration. We have new multi-button options. Let's see. In the item view, if you use configured graph, there's a new optional locked attribute to specify if the graph will be locked or not upon loading. And valid values are true or false. And if you have a secondary item view in your multi-button, there's 3 new optional attributes. Config item, which is actually not new, but it's new within this use case. So it works similar to the existing functionality in item view. You can lock your secondary item view. True is locked, false not. And we have a new attribute that specifies orientation for the secondary item view. So you can specify if you want it to position at the top, at the bottom, or to the right, which is the existing option in our earlier versions. And the default value is right. So it's the position of the secondary item view that this specifies. And here's an example of a multi-button configuration. You've got an item view, which is a graph, and it's this particular graph configuration, and it's set to be locked. And the other part of it is a secondary item view. It's a grid, this particular config item grid, and it's also set to be locked upon loading, and it's going to appear at the top. So this is what it looks like with your secondary view here and your primary graph view here. And when we get to the new the introduction of editability in the graph, you'll see that this kind of goes hand in hand with editing in the graph for a lot of use cases. Item version changes. We have added an option so you can include a message when there's no change between versions. So the attribute's called include no change message. And what it does is it places this text in your changelog. No changes, additions, or deletions have been made to attributes, parts, and description content. So here's an example for a updated items changelog with include no change message equals true. And so here between versions 2 and 3 of this requirement, there were no changes, but a new version was taken out. So this allows you in the output file to run a search for this text to see, how many times did someone take out a new version without any changes being made. So that was something, a feature request we got in from a customer. Parameters, we have additional support for default values, and default values are so great for sometimes users don't really know what to pick when they get these empty drop-down boxes for parameters. So we now have 2 options for setting a pre-selected value for a parameter. We have an existing hint context path option, and we have a new attribute called default value, which is more flexible, and it supports these data types: Boolean, string, date, integer, int64, user, and object. And you can use both of these options in the same view configuration, but for different parameters. You can't use them together for the same parameter. And of course, the default value that you write in your configuration has to be valid, otherwise it's just going to be blank. So this is an example where we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 instances of using the new default value, and then here's a hint context path usage. So this is really great because then they know they don't have to pick anything. So that's that.
Stacy,
yes.
You have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read it to you?
Wait, let's see. I can get it here. I'm not seeing it. Yeah, could you do that?
Yes. Does parameters work together with the change log?
I don't know. I'll have to get back to you, Patricia. I will get back to you after the session. Okay, and the next is we have part type configuration. We have a new constraint called allow multi-instance. And what this does, if you're not familiar with part type configuration, I'll just briefly say in the architect tool, you could go into a part in your meta model and say, okay, I want to put a constraint. I don't want to allow users to create new part types of this type. They have to pick an existing one. Or, I don't want to allow them to add new ones. I want them to create new ones always. And so this is a third constraint called allow multi-instance. And what it does is stops users from adding parts that already exist under the selected owner item. So you don't want multiple instances of the part. So false would mean that users cannot add multiple instances of the part, and of course the default is true. If you don't set this configuration, they're going to be able to do that. And this is what it looks like. I'm standing on this part here in the architect tool, edit config, and I have added it here, allow multi-instance false. So for the users, it looks like this. This guy is trying to add constant cruise control version 5 here, which he already has. And so he gets a message instance of given item already exists. This tag also has an optional attribute called allow different versions. So that's going to allow users to add other versions of the existing part. And you can only use that if you have allow multi-instance equals false. So in other words, you're saying you can't add multiple instances of this part in the same version, but yeah, I'll let you add different versions of it. So here's an example. The same thing, I had version 5 here, and I went ahead and I was able to add version 3 of it because I have allowed different versions is true. XML import export. This was something that a couple of customers were looking to have us implement, and it's the ability to exclude attributes. So it's a new tag in export, and you can exclude attributes, and it would be suitable when you want to include all attributes, for example, but you just want to exclude one. And you could use this new tag instead of included attributes. So in this example, the architect has said include attributes with these two SIDs, which is great, but if you've got 50 attributes that you want to include and one that you don't, you would have to, if you used included attributes, you'd have to list all 50 SIDs to specify what's to be included. But now you can use instead excluded attributes and just list the one that you want to exclude. So it sort of depends on what your use case is. Okay, let me see if I can demonstrate some of the cool stuff. Here's the a signature attribute here, and if I go ahead and release this baseline, I can then, there we go. So just enter my Windows, and I hit enter. So, and I've signed it. And that's what it looks like. And now I can't remove this attribute. Not gonna let me. Yeah, access denied because it's been signed. Don't think I need to show you. Well, for those of you that aren't familiar, just jump over here. You see here in this document, I've got some text here, some content. And if I clone these, then it's going to leave out that content. Let's see. Because I'm ignoring the include description. So that's when you want to clone a structure but not the content. So this is my new document and I have no content. Let's see. Here is the coverage mapping item view. And if I select these function requirements here on the left side, and one here, and I do map. So I got my mapping here of the two. Now, if I select this one again and say want to map it to another one, it doesn't add that when I'm using the distinct mapping per pair. It's creating a new mapping for the pair the second pair that I made with maintain cruise speed, instead of putting them all in the same mapping item. Let's see. I'm going to log in here real quick. Okay, I'm loading a grid here that has a lot of calculations. Let's see what I have right here. Okay, I've got it set to optimized is true. So I can scroll pretty quickly through here as it recalculates, or it's only calculated it once. Now if I go ahead and remove this new attribute here, I can just take the true out. And save, jump over here, and go back. You'll see how long it takes for the grid to load without the optimization that we implemented. So this is pretty huge. So if you have grids that do a lot of calculations, you're going to want to consider implementing this optimization option. As you can see here, I'm scrolling with my scroll wheel, and nothing's happening. It's really quite slow because it's having to recalculate and query the database to get the most up-to-date values. So I think this is pretty huge. Just put true back there. So we really recommend that you implement that anywhere that you can. So, what else can I show you? think that, I think we're just going to have to move on. Otherwise I won't get through it all. Okay, server administrators. We implemented some new application icons for the database manager, the notification server, and the test server. So you can more easily, in the GUI, you can see much more clearly if something's running or not. You can see that when a test server is stopped, it's gray. The icon is gray, and when it's running, it's colored. Also, we added a port number display in the caption. So here I've got 2 test servers running, and I just hovered over the Windows taskbar, and I can see the port numbers here without having to click on them and looking that way. Client server latency indicator. We have a new indicator here at the bottom right of the Explorer client. It's visible from any page, and it shows the approximate time that it takes to go from the client to the SystemWeaver server application and back. So it could be useful when you're trying to diagnose potential internet connectivity issues. Everybody working from home these days. It's not necessarily indicative of a problem. There could just be, it is affected by database load. So you might see it spike at one point and then go back down. So typical approximate latency times under normal load conditions in milliseconds. If you're working against a server on your laptop, it'll probably say about 2 milliseconds. Server and client on different machines in the same geographical location, like Göteborg, you might see 8 to 15 milliseconds. Mirror server, we implemented a reconnect to main. So if you're not familiar, many of you may not be running a mirror server because it's optional, but if you have your main server here and you have a mirror server in China or whatever, if your main server goes down, your mirror server goes down because it connects to the main. And you'd have to bring up your main server first and then bring up your mirror server. With R37, if your mirror server loses connection to the main for whatever reason, you might have brought it down or whatever, it's now going to attempt to reconnect automatically every 30 seconds. And as soon as it can reach the main server, it'll connect again. So it just means you just no longer have to restart a mirror if you stop a main. We implemented an option to limit the size of the SV journal file, and again, this has to do with our mirror server solution. So if you're not using it, you can just disregard. But on the main server, you have a journal file, and with R37, you can set the minimum number of most recent entries to be saved in that file. And the server will then remove old entries and just only maintain the most recent ones per the configuration that you set. So we have a new entry in the SV server.ini file called min journal entries. So in this example, I set it to 10,000 entries. And if you do that, then the number of entries will grow to 10,000 and maintain somewhere between 10,000 and 11,000. So without it, the journal file can just grow and grow and grow. And with the this limitation, then you can the file becomes much more manageable. And in our database manager tool, you can see the first transaction ID and the last transaction ID. Here you see it's about 11,000 entries. So to get started in using this, you're just going to need to decide how many transactions you want to keep, maybe monitor your SV journal file, and use the database manager tool to see how many transactions it contains, and see maybe how many there are on an average day, and then make a decision about how much how many you want to keep if you're interested in implementing this. Users, this is huge. This is the introduction of editability in our configurable graph. And the points that we really want to put across with our customers is that this is a generic view. So you could use it with all models and use cases. When you modify data via the graph view, you're modifying it in accordance with the meta model. So in the same way that you would in the structure tree. No difference. This new edit option is automatically available when an architect configures using these new tags for editability. And the tags are add part, remove part, and connect node options. I mean, you don't have to use all of these, but as soon as one of them is in your configuration, the edit mode is going to be available, or the edit options available for users on the toolbar. And right now we have support for 4 different type of connections, if you're interested in those. But basically users right-click and can access the menu options that are configured for them. And you can turn off editability as well. Say if you use these new tags and aren't ready for people to start editing, you can. There's a tag that allows you to turn it off. And of course, in the graph, you can use the existing shortcuts: Control Copy or Control C, Control V for copy paste, which allows you to copy, for example, from a grid or a structure tree and then paste in the graph. So basically, with this editability, for many use cases, you're going to be able to, users can minimize their structure tree to the far left and just work in their graph, or maybe work in a graph in a grid, in a multi-button or something, or using the secondary item view. Other enhancements in the configurable graph is support for using path query to select style for node and edge. You can still use a string as well. You can now select a port in the graph and use the neighborhood option on the toolbar. You can use the find item ribbon group here to find nodes and ports in your graph, and the hits will be highlighted in green, this little green frame. And you can lock the graph in the primary view. So here the graph is locked on phone, and then I can then navigate in the tree, and as I navigate, the selected item gets highlighted in my graph. So you can lock the graph in the primary. You can combine that with the use of a secondary item view. So you can make edits in attributes or description content on individual items. Like maybe you want to open the overview on the far right and have the graph locked on the left, and then work in both views. More enhancements. We implemented a legend option for the graph. It will be available to users if you configure it, so you have to configure the legend. And when they click on it, it opens up similar to the neighborhood. It opens a pane on the right-hand side. We implemented a refresh button on the toolbar just to make it more visible, and you can still use F5. When you select ports in the graph, they'll be highlighted in the tree. And if your data doesn't match work in a tree or balloon layout, instead of it just not showing anything, there's now a message that tells you that the graph is not a tree. Yep. Let's see where we're at. Secondary item view, I touched upon this earlier. We have new layout options for top and bottom. And you'll find them on if you click on the close menu on the far right in your secondary item view. So you have the existing right option and you have the existing undock, but now you have dock bottom and dock top as well. And here's just a picture similar to the one I showed earlier. I've got a grid in the secondary item view on the top, and I've got a graph in the primary view at the bottom. We have a new pop-up dialog for the issue editor. So if you're working in projects and you stand on an issue here, you can open up the edit issue dialog or editor in a dialog. And also in a grid view, if you're displaying issue information in a grid, it'll work there as well. You just use the Control-Alt-O to open the issue. The parts view, we implemented a new info column, an error info column to provide information if a part type's been changed in some way so that it's no longer supported by the meta model. So to view this new column, you would have to right-click on on the header row and select error info. So if you see a red highlighting, you can get more information if you do that. And it's implemented for 3 scenarios. The first one is where the part multiplicity has been changed from to single. And the second one is where for some reason the part type's been changed or removed, so it's not supported anymore. And the third is when the part type has been deprecated. So a little bit more explanation as to what the problem is, and of course the red highlighting. We did various path query optimizations for reports. So it's going to increase the performance of reports that contain a lot of these queries, and it's most noticeable with structures that contain simple parts as opposed to structural parts. And most structures are built up of simple parts. So I think you'll be real pleased to see the performance improvement there as well. And we did optimizations in the structure tree area. The loading of simple parts has been optimized. And again, this is going to affect most of your structures. And we're really, really excited about this. I'm going to show you an example. So you will no longer have time to go get a cup of coffee as you wait for a big structure to load. Together with this, we've removed the initial kind of legacy default view setting for new item types. So if you're an architect and you create a new item type, it's going to look like this for users. There's not going to be a default view. You need to actually go in. And let me start by saying that this doesn't exist, doesn't affect existing default settings. Those will still be there when you upgrade. But you will need to go in and create a default view setting for new item types or for item types that, for example, nobody's ever created an item of that type. You'll need to create a view. And this is more to have architects thinking more and focusing on the default views and what they should be to provide the best optimized view of the structure for the users or the user groups, because users work in different parts of a structure and maybe they don't need to see everything. They just need to see what they're working on. But this also has increased the performance of the loading of trees. So let me really quick show you some things here. Oh, I only have 10 minutes left. I think I'm just going to demonstrate the huge performance improvement in loading the structure tree. Let's see here. So, okay, so here I'm working in, this is R36, and I'm going to open up this huge work area structure I have called Standard Routines and Procedures. And I'm logging into an R37 server, but this is a client enhancement. So usually you have to wait like this long to open that up. Okay. And then this, we added a little icon on the About tab here, which I like, but it tells me I'm in the R37 here. So I'm going to load this same structure. So that's pretty cool. Huge improvement in loading structures that are built on simple part types. Okay. So just to review quickly the breaking changes in R37, we've got that minor version update, which typically isn't a breaking change, but if you're going to want to implement the digital signature, this new signature attribute type, you will have to recompile your API applications and update your REST API. We updated the extensions API, and so it requires that you recompile all of your in-house developed extension views. And if you're using the coverage matrix view in the hazard identification extension, then you're going to possibly need to redo your non-applicable part of the configurations. And then just some recommendations from me. Because of the default structure tree view no longer existing for new item types, it's a good opportunity to always set optimized settings for your users, both the new ones that you're going to be creating, and then also maybe take a look at your existing ones to make sure you're showing just enough for users to do the work that they need, and not too much to have them have to pull up a million or tens of thousands of items in the tree that they're not going to even look at. And then, of course, a big thing is to review your grid use cases and use that to optimized equals true wherever you can, because users will see a huge improvement in viewing, scrolling, exporting to Excel. And then just quickly, I wanted to mention we did do some bug fixes. I think there's 7 of them here, and you can read more about them on the support portal. That's all I had. So we have, 7 minutes if anybody has any questions about anything I showed or.
Yes, Stacy, you have a few questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can repeat them then.
Yeah.
Hi.
What is it?
Hi,
Patricia. Hi.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I asked you with digital signature.
Mm-hmm.
Then you typed in a password,
Mm-hmm.
but at Penta we use single sign-on, so we don't really define a specific password for the server. Which password were you using when you were using the? How does it work with single sign-on? That's my question.
It's your Windows password.
It's the Windows password.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good news.
That's
Perfect. And then I was wondering also with the optimization you did for single parts.
Yes.
I mean, since we sort of have to use but we're using the test model,
Yeah.
and there you have,
Yeah.
and there we have the most data.
Mhm.
So, and many of our views are a compound of both simple and structured parts. Are you planning to do anything
Yes,
on the optimization?
that's a whole nother monster in itself. So yes, there is absolutely a desire to address that, to try to do some optimization there as well.
It would be, I mean, otherwise I think it would be interesting to hear if you can sort of think of doing the test model in with simple parts instead.
Yeah, that,
I think if that's not I mean, if that's the route to go, I think it would be nice if you did that work instead, because okay. Anyhow, that
I
was
mean,
just
without saying too
thought.
much and probably like misinforming, but I have heard discussions about, why are we having notes here when we don't need them, and so
Yeah.
I think just to answer your question, I know that there's talk about there are plans to address or to do an optimization structural. Yeah.
And